Retired warbear ignores his former companion, but what happens next will leave you in tears. As the sun set over the lush forests of Alaska, painting the sky with golden and crimson hues, a man's quest to reconnect with a lost part of his soul began to unfold. Eric Collins, a wildlife ranger and former soldier, had carried the scars of war and separation for years. On this fateful evening, his journey led him to a wildlife sanctuary, a place where destiny had something extraordinary waiting for him. What happens when two souls, torn apart by time and circumstance, meet again? What if the one you loved doesn't recognize you anymore? Eric's story, intertwined with Kodiak the bear, is one of loyalty, hope, and the power of second chances. It's a tale that will stir your heart and remind you of the unbreakable bond between man and nature. This emotional journey is brought to life by World of the Jungle, where we tell stories that inspire, uplift, and connect us to the wonders of the natural world. Subscribe now to World of the Jungle and experience heartfelt stories like this one. Eric Collins had lived through many battles, both on the field and within himself. As he stood in front of the sanctuary's gate, looking at Kodiak's enclosure, he couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. The bear he had once loved and cared for was now a stranger, a shadow of the companion he had known. The Kodiak he remembered was a young, vibrant creature full of life, playfulness, and loyalty. But what stood before him now was a grizzly, scarred and weary, with eyes that seemed to have forgotten the warmth of a friend. The realization hit him hard. Time had passed, and in the years since their parting, both of them had been scarred. But for Eric, the worst scar of all was not the physical wounds from war. It was the one left by the separation from his beloved bear. When Kodiak had been taken away after the war, Eric had tried to move on, but the bear's absence lingered like a ghost in the back of his mind. Every moment of his new life as a wildlife ranger felt incomplete, a piece of him missing, and that piece was Kodiak. As the days wore on, Eric visited the sanctuary every chance he got. Each visit, he brought something new, hoping to reignite a spark of recognition in Kodiak's eyes. At first, the bear didn't seem to care much for Eric's efforts. He would stand by the fence, watching the ranger approach with cautious eyes, and then retreat into the safety of his enclosure. But Eric wasn't discouraged. He understood the bear's wariness. After all, it wasn't just Eric who had changed over the years. Kodiak had too. One afternoon, after several weeks of visits, Eric was sitting by the enclosure, as he had done countless times before. He felt the weight of the silence, the absence of connection that once had been so strong. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the landscape, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "I wonder if you remember me, buddy. I wonder if you remember the times we spent together. The nights we'd sit by the fire, the way you'd rest your head on my shoulder when we were tired, the way you saved my life during that ambush." Kodiak, who had been pacing inside the enclosure, stopped and looked up. For the first time, he made eye contact with Eric, directly, not just a fleeting glance. Eric's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bear's eyes seemed to soften just a little. He took a cautious step forward and then another, his massive paws silent against the earth. "Do you remember those days?" Eric continued, his voice steady despite the emotion building within him. "I remember you, Kodiak. I never stopped thinking about you." The bear sniffed at the air, his nostrils flaring as if testing the scent of Eric's words. For a moment, the two of them simply stood there, locked in a silent exchange. It was a moment of fragile hope, a flicker of the connection they had once shared. That night, as Eric made his way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Kodiak had responded. Maybe, just maybe, the bear remembered him, even if it was only a shadow of their past bond. The next few days were filled with more visits, each one more intense than the last. Eric would sit for hours, talking to the bear about everything, about the war, about their time together, about the life Eric had built since then. He spoke about the forest they would now roam together, the trails they would hike, the streams they would explore. Slowly, the bear began to approach him more often, sniffing his clothes, rubbing his head against the bars of the enclosure. The signs were subtle, but they were there. But just as things seemed to be improving, the sanctuary received an unexpected request. Kodiak was to be moved to a new wildlife reserve, one that was larger and offered more space for the bear to roam. Eric understood the need for Kodiak to have a bigger home, but a part of him was devastated. This would be his last chance to reconnect with the bear he had once loved. The thought of Kodiak being sent away felt like another loss, another painful goodbye. Eric spent the next few days preparing for Kodiak's departure. He gathered supplies for the trip, snacks the bear loved, blankets, and even the old jacket he had kept for all those years. He didn't know what would happen when Kodiak was taken to the new reserve, but he couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, their bond would survive this final test. On the day of Kodiak's departure, Eric stood by the gates of the sanctuary, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He watched as the bear was loaded into the transport vehicle, his massive form fitting awkwardly into the crate designed for his journey. Kodiak's eyes flicked toward Eric, and for a brief moment, the two shared a look, a fleeting connection that was enough to make Eric's chest tighten. "I'll never forget you," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll find you again. I promise." Kodiak let out a low growl, and then, as if acknowledging Eric's words, he settled the crate, his body relaxing. The vehicle doors closed, and the long journey to the new reserve began. Eric watched as the vehicle disappeared from view, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. Days passed, and Eric tried to adjust to the absence of the bear. He threw himself into his work as a wildlife ranger, but there was a hollow feeling inside him that nothing seemed to fill. He kept his promise, though. He kept searching. Every chance he got, he would visit the reserve, hoping to catch a glimpse of Kodiak. He would hike the trails around the reserve, calling out for the bear, hoping for some sign, some indication that their bond still remained. Months went by, and Eric's hope began to dwindle. Kodiak had settled into the reserve, becoming part of the landscape, a creature of the wild once more. Eric's visits grew less frequent, his hope fading into resignation. But then, one cold winter's day, when the air was crisp and the snow lay thick on the ground, Eric received a call. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, one of the reserve's caretakers. "We've got a situation," the voice said. "There's been an incident near the eastern border of the reserve. A bear is showing unusual aggression toward the staff. We think it might be Kodiak." Eric's heart raced. He knew it was him. Without hesitation, he grabbed his gear and rushed to the reserve. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Staff members were scattered, trying to regain control of the situation. Kodiak, now a full-grown grizzly, stood at the center of it all, his massive form towering over the scene. He was agitated, pacing restlessly, his eyes scanning the humans around him. Eric stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out to Kodiak, his voice calm but firm. "Kodiak, it's me, Eric. Do you remember me?" The bear paused, his eyes locking onto Eric's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if recognizing the voice that had once been his only companion, Kodiak let out a low growl and took a step toward him. Eric held his ground, never breaking eye contact. "It's okay, buddy. It's just me. I'm here. You're safe now." Slowly, Kodiak took another step, his massive paws leaving deep imprints in the snow. He lowered his head, letting out a soft grunt, and nuzzled Eric's outstretched hand. Tears filled Eric's eyes as he finally allowed himself to exhale. The bear had remembered. Against all odds, against all time and distance, the bond they had shared was still there, and in that moment, Eric knew that they were no longer two broken souls, lost to the world. They were home. Together, Eric and Kodiak returned to the wild, no longer bound by the scars of war, but instead bound by the love and trust they had rebuilt, one step at a time. Their journey had been long, filled with pain and loss, but it was also filled with healing, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his bear. And as they walked side by side into the wilderness, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together.